All right, we're good. All right, so we obviously heard about a couple interesting components and some application of how do we bring things to life to create agents. So I want to ask a question to start. I read something this week that Gartner, big analyst firm, predicts that by 2027, 70% of the current agent projects are going to get killed. What do you guys have to say about that?
So as a consultant, I've been building software for 25 years. It's funny, Gartner left out the other part of the equation, which is how many regular software projects die before they go to production, which I would suspect is maybe 60% never make it to production. And so I think that there's so much possibility with agents. There's so much momentum behind it. There's so much to be won in terms of reducing costs and making teams way more prolific, that there's no way that 70% of projects will die by 2027, which is an eternity from now. It is an absolute eternity from now. But maybe
so you're saying they'll die faster? No.
They'll die faster. I think that the timelines are so short. Yeah. When we do projects, we literally stop every 30 days. We say, hold on 1 second, are we using the right tool set here? Has the game changed significantly? And nobody has any idea what's happening in 2027. Definitely not Gartner analysts. So I'll leave it on that one.
Yeah, I would echo that. I think it's a function of probably where the market is today. And so if you look at where customers are in their journey as far as building agents and managing these things at scale, and you extrapolate out from there, yeah, sure, maybe that's maybe that 70% is more for the clicks than a reality. I think as we all collectively as a community that's building agents up-level our knowledge and our education, and we start to get our arms around some of the not only the tools and processes, but also some of the challenges that we encounter when we do these things at scale. I think you see that number drop from there.
Yeah, I'd echo that. I mean, I think two things are probably true. Everything is going to be agentic by 2027 because we see it. Who here isn't building an agent, right?
Who here is not building an agent?
And the same thing is true when we talk to large organizations. You'd be surprised at how old and stodgy some companies are that are all in on agents. And so I think agents will be everywhere by 2027, and a lot of them will also fail before they get there. But I think the sheer volume of shots on goal is going to be sufficient to transform a lot.
Yeah, I think you're also going to see a maturation of it, right? I think if you listen to Harrison Chase, our CEO, talk, one of the things he starts to talk about is this idea of ambient agents as a sort of a next frontier. And this is where, if you think about, when I think you mentioned it during your demo, is that there's this stop and start process where a human has to interact with the agent, right? And so that is, you are bound by the interactions that are human initiated. Well, what if you have an agent that just exists and is sort of listening in and is event driven and looks at a process and goes, oh, without human intervention, I'm going to spin up, I'm going to do this thing in the background that returns some sort of result or brings something to bear. So I think the nature of agents and how they communicate and how they even initiate is changing rapidly.
So within the world of AI, right, and just computing, do you view what's happening now as a platform shift or small leap forward?
I think it's the next transformational wave. I think the really interesting thing comes at the intersection of this bioengineering, machine learning, right? I mean, if we really want to kind of look at the convergence of all these different things at the singular point, AI is certainly a massive part of that. But I think its impact on our lives is going to be measurable, and its intersection with other areas of tech that are developing so quickly. It would just be conjecture on my part as far as what that would actually mean for us as far as our day-to-day lives, but the impact will be real, that's for sure.
Yeah, I think it's for sure a platform shift on a few different levels. I think one at a technical level, for people in the room who are software developers, it's already a massive paradigm shift. Developing a deterministic system in a normal programming language is night and day from building an agent. It's a totally different stack. It's a totally different set of testing tools, and a totally different set of frameworks, totally different set of concerns and things to worry about. What's easy over here is incredibly difficult over there, and vice versa. And a lot of developers who don't have machine learning backgrounds have a tremendous amount of learning ahead of them in order to be able to build even a basic set of agents.
Yeah.
And so there is a paradigm shift, and I equate that paradigm shift to the same thing we saw in the early days of web and cloud. Right? If you were a software developer coming up in the early 2000s, the prior generation of client-server-based developers, thought what you were doing wasn't real software development. You're not managing your own memory. You're not doing garbage collection. You're using Java. That's not real dev. That's very different. But then the entire world became, cloud-based, web-based systems, and I think we're seeing the same exact transformation right now in agents. It's all becoming about non-deterministic software, and that's a totally different type of development.
Yeah.
I think we're seeing the same thing in terms of user experiences and customer expectations. And I'll start with the customer expectations side. If you've used ChatGPT enough, you've gotten used to just expressing your intentions and getting a result. And so when you go into Google, it feels archaic. It drives you nuts, right? So you go to Perplexity. But then when you go and interact with Salesforce.com, you want to kill yourself. There's 37 clicks to even figure out where to go. And the future of software, because of this ChatGPT-ification of experiences, where it's going to be like the Google search bar, where you state your intention, but instead of getting a litany of search results, you get the result, you get the outcome you want. And we're seeing that already, like more forward-thinking software companies are giving these intention-based interactions already today. Perplexity being a great example. And then I think from the application side, user interfaces are being completely rethought. And I don't know exactly what that's going to look like in the future, but there's a lot of innovation happening of how do we rethink what a UI looks like, or should there even be a UI?
I think it also opens the door for more participation across function and maybe even ability. Kind of this idea of the democratization of AI. And so if we start looking at even very basic stuff now, where if you have templatized agents that you can then repurpose, et cetera, maybe you don't have to be all in the weeds. So I think that our relationship with AI, as far as creators, is rapidly evolving as well.
When was the last time anybody downloaded an auth library for their app, right?
An auth library.
An auth library for a normal app, right? You're building a normal Django app or a normal, JavaScript app. You don't build your own auth. You don't build your own anything anymore. You just assemble it from a series of Python packages, right?
Yep.
I believe the same thing's going to happen with agents in the future, where you're not going to build the entire agent yourself. There's going to be sub-agents that you're just importing from some sort of package manager.
Right. I think the question is like, is this a platform shift? I'd let the audience answer it. I would say, in the audience, who is really excited about generative AI? Okay. And then in the audience, who is like buying land in Montana, like waking up in a cold sweat being like, I won't have a job in 5 years? Okay, I got three. Now the answer is mixed. And so the idea that we can all abandon a lot of these tasks that we loathe, such as logging into Salesforce, such as building applications on top of Salesforce, all of this like rote, menial, dreadful tasks are going away. And we're going to be 100 times more prolific as individuals. So the idea that it's not a paradigm shift is wild. Because nobody was waking up in cold sweats when Facebook apps came out. When cloud computing emerged on the scene, no one was freaking out about moving to Montana and getting a sniper rifle ready for the robot invasion. But now people are. And so yeah, absolutely a paradigm shift.
So I want to switch gears for a second, and there's a protocol Alex touched on a little bit that's gaining a tremendous amount of buzz and momentum. It's called MCP. Anthropic published it. It's, as Alex talked about, the way that tools can talk to LLMs. And what you've seen recently is a bunch of legacy vendors that, let's say, were in the integration business, have basically come out with statements like, we've built a MCP server that takes our 30,000 API integrations and we allow them to seamlessly communicate with an LLM, and we didn't have to change anything to do it, right? Good or bad?
Who's using MCP?
NA2A.
NA2A. Successfully.
What's define success?
No, I think A2A of the two, A2A is definitely, and I know that's kind of a lead-in. A2A is definitely a little bit more exciting, I think, as far as the applications, because if you think about individual companies, everyone out there building their own sort of agents to do various different things, one agent is going to have to talk to, an agent at JP Morgan is going to potentially have to talk to an agent at another trading firm, and so how do they do that in some sort of consistent, secure sort of manner? So that is a far longer conversation, probably a little bit more interesting maybe than MCP. MCP is not even that old, right? I mean,
MCP is a few months old.
It's yeah.
So I think, well, I'll comment on the protocols, your point, and then I'll answer your question around like legacy vendors. On the protocols, I think MCP and A2A are ultimately going to converge and compete on the same front, because I think an agent calling another agent in some cases is going to start to look more like a tool call, because if you put any intelligence in a tool, it's an agent. So MCP is, I think, naturally going to gravitate there, and A2A is naturally going to gravitate towards tools. So, but all the buzz is in MCP. Now, MCP is not yet production grade, so put that to the side. But it will eventually. We're big believers in MCP. We're contributors to the stack. But I think there's a funny thing happening right now, because unlike all the prior paradigm shifts, the incumbents, the existing companies, missed them typically, right? Blockbuster sat there while Netflix ate its lunch. And this time around, it's interesting to watch the incumbents suddenly wake up and try and shape themselves to the new paradigm. The problem is they're not native to the new paradigm. They don't have agent developers on staff. They don't really know what they're doing. You look at a lot of the MCP servers, they're not built by the product teams, right? They're built by the developer relations teams, and they're just wrappers. And it's not just MCP, all the agent stuff. Mark Benioff goes out and says Agent Force, and nothing happens.
Yeah.
Has anybody used Agent Force? Does anyone know what even Agent Force even is?
Yeah.
It's atrocious.
But how many people have used some sort of sales or marketing agent in the last 3 months or 6 months? Most people have, and they're not from Salesforce. And so I think there's a really funny thing happening right now in the market where the incumbents are racing to be relevant and want to use all the buzzwords, but unfortunately they have older code bases that are for different architectures, and they're not native to the ecosystem, and so they don't know how to deliver the right thing to the right people in the right way.
Yeah, I think the Benioff thing is interesting too, because it strikes me as a little bit of a defensive sort of posture. Like, you see this thing sort of coming and you almost realize that, hey, CRMs maybe aren't going to be as relevant as they were in the past. Yeah. Do I have to go to this central repository to generate reports, et cetera? Or can I just go into a chat interface and say, hey, tell me your top 5 sales that are at risk over the next 90 days, right? And do I even need to bother with a CRM?
Yeah. So that data has been reverse ETL'd into Snowflake, and so why do I even need to talk to Salesforce?
Yeah, right. So everyone has to make that pivot in some way, shape, or form. And to your point, how do you repurpose a development team that was built fundamentally to do something that's much different?
Yeah, and it's really challenging. If you read the work of Clay Christensen from Harvard, this is where disruption happens. The word disruption comes from these events. And as much as an incumbent player might want to do the right thing and say the right thing and build the right thing, it's so difficult to get out of their own momentum.
Yeah, it's hard.
Their business models have to change. If you're Salesforce and the UI no longer matters, then what are you? Are you just a dumb database?
Yeah.
That's hard to charge $1 million a year for, right? And so then what's the new business model?
Yeah.
Those are very, very hard challenges. They sound mundane, but they're what get in the way of the Blockbusters of the world from becoming the Netflixes of the world. And that's why you can't name a software company other than Microsoft that predates the internet.
Oracle.
But Oracle acquired their way back into safety.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, it's... so, your Uber's here. I'll add one thing to that question. because I love that question, right? So I think there's a huge difference between AI native and AI enabled, right? And I think there's a huge chunk of the market that basically is like looking at AI like they had a Scrabble board and a little tile holder, and every tile was an A or an I, and if they just put that at the end of any word, they had a new word and they got more points, right? And they're not rethinking the problem, right? If we go back to what everybody said, like it seems as if the consensus is that it is a major platform shift, probably the biggest that we've seen in computing, right? And if it is a platform shift, right, most of the things that are the fundamental building blocks, right, need to be rethought. And we've already seen that start at the hardware, right? You know, obviously now it's GPUs everywhere that are kind of like the brain, right? And then we've seen the next layer, which is the large language model, right? And then we're seeing the next layer, which are some of the orchestration frameworks with what LangChain's doing. Then we're seeing the next layer, which is middleware and things like Arcade. And we're going to continue to see every layer, right, of the fundamental building blocks of how we assemble things change, right? And it's happened through computing history.
And if I can just add to that before I bail, I think you made a really great point earlier about skeuomorphism.
Right.
And I think this is where the opportunity sits for everybody in this room as you're thinking about what you want to do. People who are already in the market with pre-agent companies and products, they're thinking about it as skeuomorphism. They're thinking about what does it mean to be Salesforce in an agentic world. That's the wrong question. Like that's how you get derivative products. That's how you get me-too products. The next CRM of the future isn't going to start as a CRM.
Right.
It's going to be solving a brand new problem in an agentic way.
I think this is the next one up, right? Is that for 20 years, every business idea needed to be pushed through this medium.
Mm-hmm.
And what do we need this for? Right? Of all the things that could break the stranglehold of screens or phones, what do I need this thing for? Why do I need a keyboard? Why do I need to interact with software? I have my voice. Compute is ephemeral. And so this could be the next casualty of...
Hey, amen, because I'm fucking addicted to mine.
I have young kids, so I've already seen...
Yeah, likewise.
The future. My kids think Google's a voice. They don't know that it's a search bar. My daughter gets angry at me and calls me a dinosaur when I type on my phone. And she yanks it out of my phone and hits dictate and then basically talks to it. And so my kids are already living a voice-based relationship with technology. It's coming.
I agree.
But again, the challenge for all of us in this room who want to be a part of this revolution, it is not about Uber for gardening or an agentic Salesforce. It's about really finding a problem that you're seeing in front of you and then trying to tackle the problem with an agent. And that's the thing that startups and new companies have an advantage over all the incumbents, because that's how the new stacks get assembled. Like the history doesn't repeat itself; it only rhymes.
You can also do it with smaller teams now, right? With just the add-on effect of the AI tools that are out there. I mean, you look at Cursor AI, a 10-person team, 15-person team, with like 200 million net ARR in a very short period of time. That is the new model for how companies will be created. These things will pop up out of nowhere because now that democratization aspect, you give people access, really talented individuals access to these sorts of tools, and turn them loose. The innovation is going to come from places that you never saw before. So you think about that innovator dilemma. So I don't know if everyone's familiar with the concept, but essentially it's as you move up market, you are going to start to build your product and services more and more toward the large enterprises. That opens up a space for disruptors to kind of come in. The speed with which you can operate now with lean teams, I mean, the disruption is everywhere.
Any questions from the audience? Go ahead.
This is not a technical question. So much. So I have an agency, my day job, and we build very, very large websites. Like we just did a $2 million website for the National Gallery of Art, which we actually lost money on, shockingly. And like they're doing like Drupal. Is that like should I just fire everybody? What's happening? What part of that stack is going to be relevant 3 years from now?
I mean, I think we're already starting to see a change. I mean, you're already starting to see agentic web builders. I mean, you've already seen on the UI side. I mean, if you are a visual designer or a low-end front-end developer, you're freaking the fuck out when you see Bolt or Lovable, right? A normal web app is simpler.
Yeah.
Does Josh's team go away, or does Josh's team become 100x more prolific?
I think the people on your team who aren't using AI today, they go away. The folks on your team that are using AI, they persist and they up level and they do so at faster.
You guys should say that the web and the interface go away.
Well, so I do think.
So it's fine.
Yeah, but look, I think there will be a natural progression, right? I mean, in my mind, the biggest innovation of large language models is that the interface to computing is changing, right? And we've already started to see that, right? But we're still mostly looking at things in a browser today, right? How long that persists, TBD. I think there's some inertia that people like us as humans, right? I mean, our eyes are one of our key senses, right? And so therefore, and a lot of us are obviously very visual in terms of how we consume information. So I don't know that from an information gathering perspective that the interface will completely go away, right? But how we interact with that interface, like, Alex talked about his kids.
Thank you, Alex.
I will leave one last point on this point, which is I think taste is becoming a really important thing right now. And so without taste, you're kind of dead with AI because you garbage in, garbage out. But also, I would say right now we're all wowed by the productivity gains, but those productivity gains are going to become commoditized. And so you're either on that curve or you're going to be way behind that curve.
Yeah, that's good. And like that, he's out. But so I have 3 daughters, right? And I don't think my 10-year-old, and we also have a baby, I don't think either of them are ever going to use a mouse, right? And so, like, I think those are now. I didn't say they're not going to look at a screen. I hope we look at screens less, right? It's funny. We've had some. I've spent some time with several of the device companies that all have voice. Well, not Apple, but the other one. They all have voice systems that suck, right? I think we'd all like to see Siri actually be able to do things, or if we're Android people or Samsung people, like Galaxy AI or Bixby actually do things meaningful, and they struggle with that, right? And they're trying to think through it, but it's hard. Go ahead, question.
If you could wave a magic wand, what would you have them do?
So, like, I'll give you a good example. So I live in Austin. I don't live here. I travel all the time. Arcade's headquartered in San Francisco, and we have customers in New York, and so I kind of go all over the place. I would love, right, to be able to something simple like, hey Siri, I got to go back to San Francisco next week. Book my trip. Okay. You know my preferences. Like, that I fly Delta. You know that I stay at Hyatt's, right? Like, but you can't do that unless you can authenticate and authorize to the apps that are not native to Apple, right? If you think about Siri right now, the only apps that they really can interact with are either things that you've actually built HomeKit, like, so you're doing stuff at home, right? Or they're native apps, right? So
is this just like Fantasyland? Like, we can make an AI agent do whatever we want?
I mean, that's a simple one.
Easy for me. My taxes. Like, if I could have an agent where I just fed it the thing and it spit out the number and that was done, great, sign me up.
I mean, TurboTax does a decent job of that already, and I'm sure it'll get better. I think that's coming.
Yeah. I think that who doesn't have a giant list of bucket list items that are collecting dust on a shelf somewhere that you thought was not possible, financially possible with time, that are all of a sudden now possible. You're talking about like waving your magic wand. What would the agents do? They help me do all those things that are literally collecting dust.
Okay, so thank you for all this discussion. So let's just, so the example in the demo was bring me the last 10 messages in the Slack channel, right? And it was able to do that, right? It's just looking at the timestamps in the Slack channel and it prints them out. But that example you just gave is book me a flight from Austin to San Francisco, right? That's something even a human can mess up. There's so many steps, right? What date? What time do I care about? What airline do I want? What seat am I going to There's like 100 different steps in that.
If it has all of my access
But if it
and
has the
all
state.
of my history and maybe all of my credit card transactions, and it knows that, like, if you look at my last 10 flights that I did, right, I almost always try to avoid flying on Mondays, and I like to get home on Thursdays, right? Or I like to leave, if I'm going to leave on a Monday, I like to leave on Monday evening, right? And if it had access to my calendar and it could see what I needed to do while I'm there, right? It can reason all of those things.
That's like 100 different steps. Like,
Yeah.
That's like 50, that's very...
It's very possible, like incredibly possible.
But it's gonna miss if your daughter guilted you on the phone and you need to go back a little earlier.
Sure.
It's only as good as the
Right,
context.
and then you. So it's never going to be perfect, right?
You hate flying Frontier. You don't like sitting in the middle
But
seat.
I have an assistant, and I just be like, "Hey Naz, I need to book me a flight to New York, get me a hotel." Like, she knows what I want. She slaps you back. She's like, "This is what I found," and I'm like, "Cool."
Yeah.
Thumbs up it, and then it's done. Like, I could imagine, like, I love the Naz, but I think that all that stuff, I'm very predictable.
Yes, exactly. And you know what? Like, a lot of people are, and especially once you. So there's a whole bunch of interesting things happening in the world of agentic commerce. I've been spending time with Visa and American Express and a bunch of other people, and they're all thinking about like if I have like my entire purchase history, well, guess what? I have crazy hyper personalization, right? I know everything about your preferences based on where your money's going, right?
It's all about how you onboard them.
Correct, right? So I mean, it's like, yes, there's a lot of steps, but you know, it's very possible. Like, so for me, I mean, I'm an old dude, and I joined a seed stage company while they were still in stealth, and I'm grinding away. And the only reason I agreed to do that, number one, Alex and I have known each other for a really long time, right? And I think they're doing something very, very cool. But the AI is so powerful that if you're used to like giving good direction to people, right? And you've done that for a long time, you can get tremendous results from the LLM. Like Alex and I had a little exchange, like I figured something out while we were in New York and I was on my way to San Francisco, and he's like, okay, like take that and like write a plan. And literally in 2 hours, I had like a 12-week step-by-step iterative plan to go run parallel experiments, right? In terms of like marketing and sales related things. And I didn't just like, it wasn't a 0-shot deal, but like me chatting with Claude, right? It was something that probably a cross-functional team, it would have taken like a really long time to do that, right? And like that's some of the cool, powerful things.
I think,
So,
Alex, sorry, go ahead.
Instead of asking Siri to book your travel, why don't you put Tim's program in there and ask Siri to build you $1 billion company?
Yeah, hey, that sounds, I like that too.
Is that possible?
I mean,
Execute it.
Well, not if,
I mean, we used to joke like we're walking into a big presentation, and we need to build a deck for a big presentation, and I've got 10 versions of old decks, and we used to joke like maybe we could just throw them all into a folder, and it could just figure out which slides are going to be most relevant for this meeting we're about to walk into. That's possible now.
So actually, I don't know if anyone knows Gene Kim or heard of Gene Kim, the Phoenix Project. He's actually built something to that effect where he has given all these talks and all these presentations all over the world. And so he has a pretty much a database of all of his content. And so when he has to do a new presentation, he can interact with a agent chatbot that he's built that sits over his knowledge base that will produce at least a first pass, right? Does he just take it and run with it? Probably not.
but you could refine it in a couple of years
exactly.
to like keep running it.
Well,
through
but
filters,
I think some of
right?
it too, again, this
Launch
goes back to
website.
that human in the
Yeah.
loop thing, right? And
Oh.
we talked about,
Market it on Facebook or whatever we're using
Yeah.
in a couple of years. It's like,
Or eventually, when we all have like neural links embedded in us, then you don't even have to go back. It just knows exactly what you want, and then it changes. Yeah.
So I guess how do you think about like screen level authentication? When I go on my phone to book a flight, I'm not like, oh, let me log into Delta, let me check my Slacks and my calendar, and log into Google, etc. Like, why wouldn't I just give it my Face ID?
Yeah.
Essentially, like that's how I operate. I don't log into each of those systems.
I mean, hopefully, that's just all about how the token gets passed, right? If it can consume a passkey, which is your face, and anytime there's commerce, though, there's going to have to be some level of like last mile verification to truly complete the transaction, let's say. But like all the authentication should be able to be completely streamlined, right?
Well, I guess I think about it like the amount of subscriptions I have that I don't realize I have. Like I'm not verifying those transactions, and they're still happening. So how is that different?
Well, you verified them at some point, right? And you click subscription, and it just keeps going, right?
Question for Jason. How are you guys thinking about like observability? This is completely different from what we were just talking about.
yeah, sure.
No,
Thinking about like, we're talking about maybe 5 or 6 agents here. So when you talk about enterprises who are going to be deploying like swarms of agents, how are you guys thinking about like observability and visibility of that? And how do you actually manage that? Like, have you even seen interfaces or even like experiences when dealing with swarms?
So I haven't had any personal conversations where we are dealing with swarms. That would be something I would take back to the team and ask if we have anyone that has a swarm architecture that they are performing traces on today. But I think some of that would be subject to the agents themselves, because typically when we're doing tracing, it's going to be on a project level. And so if I'm an organization and I consume LangSmith or LangGraph platform, we set up an organization. Within an organization, there's a concept of a workspace. A workspace is a trust barrier, if you will, right? So if you have separate different teams, and then within that workspace, you're going to have any number of projects that you're working on, which are going to be deployed agents, or for example. Setting up tracing is super easy, but then they're going to be, the tracing is normally on a specific project, if you will. So while the swarm might exist outside of those trust boundaries, et cetera, it would really depend on probably the access controls. And so like if you're provisioning either role-based access controls, or like how you're doing that will govern what level of the organization or what individual can see what scope, but the actual tracing itself happens on a per project level. And the traces are nothing more than input-output pairs. So it's me as a user making invocation of the graph and getting a response.
Question, Donna?
As a kind of like a follow-up on observability, how are you guys thinking about evals and best practices, especially as evals at some point like labeling seemed to like go out of fashion, and then now with evals, labeling's all back. And the question kind of is, what is the cadence in which you're updating evals? How are the evals being recreated? Is it like a data scientist who's making the evals, or are you getting feedback from users using like?
Yeah, sure. So you can, it's a good question. So there's the capability to do both online and offline evaluations. So from an online perspective, you kick off, when you saw Tim kick off his app and you can see it kind of moving through a graph, we can see that trace actively happen. If we see that trace and maybe we want to add a rule to it, and we say, let's filter out all of the traces that are hitting our project. I want to know about every trace that happens that's over 20 seconds of latency or under 20 seconds latency or whatever it is. We can set that rule. We can add it to an annotation queue. So if we have subject matter experts that we want to review that interaction, provide some level of feedback, we create a rubric. We basically allow them to judge that or score that interaction in some way, shape, or form. We can then add that interaction, so a live trace, we can add that into a data set. Our data set becomes a golden data set, which is a reference sort of set of interactions that we will then iterate on, whether we're doing, changing our prompt or we run experiments. Maybe we want to change the graph architecture. That's more in the offline stuff. This is where we get into like that traditional CI/CD sort of workflow sort of motion. And so maybe I look at, hey, I'm going to send it the same sort of set of examples in my golden data set, but I want to judge it. I want to use the same model for consistency, but what I really want to test is what happens if I add a reflection step to that? What is that? How does that impact my response score? Is that going to change the conciseness? Is it going to change the accuracy? What does it do for latency? Because now if we have another step in there, maybe the input traverses the graph, it gets to the bottom and says, you know what, I want to think about that a little bit more, I'm going to call another tool. So okay, now our latency potentially goes up. We can see what the token count is associated with that. So generally speaking, all of that is facilitated, and the foundational piece of that is the observability piece, right? And so we say great observability leads to great evaluations. The best way that I can describe it, I was talking about this with like a non-technical audience. My friends had kind of asked me about LangChain, and I was like, it's like giving your order to the maitre d', and they go back into the kitchen, and then your food comes out. You don't see anything that happens back there, right? And so that observability piece, as far as what is my agent doing in the first place, but then also how do I have some sort of data-driven approach where I can apply a methodology forward, where I'm actually being scientific about the changes I'm making, and also understanding how does that affect my app once I go to production. So now I know if I use a certain set of tools, or maybe I narrow the scope of the search at a specific step with some sort of determinism in the graph, or maybe I change out the LLM specifically. What's that impact going to be? And so I know what that interaction is going to look like when I go to production. So I think that the observability piece is very foundational, but it's really important to have eval-driven development, because when we look at over 100 million people who have downloaded our open source and are building with LangChain and LangGraph, the number one barrier that they say as far as moving to production is quality of the output. And so the more that we can zero in and make intelligent decisions about our agent architecture, the better we can feel, or the more confident we can feel about how that agent's going to respond and what that customer experience is going to be in production. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it's more like one of the questions is kind of, who are you seeing creating that golden data set? Are you seeing, especially for production apps, is it customer success? Is it customer support? Is it just the developers? Is it just the data engineers?
Typically it's like so within each organization it's probably a little bit different, but you basically want to assign whoever you consider a subject matter expert, either for that project or for whatever that space is. And so like for us, for example, in LangChain chat, which is what we use, it's basically a RAG agent chatbot, right? So it has our knowledge base, we interact with it. So if you ever see a product demo, we're doing all the tracing, et cetera, on that. And so we'll actually have our subject matter experts, or actually our deployed engineers, who will go in and look at an input-output pair and give some kind of reference and being like, yeah, that's a good interaction. You can add that to a data set. You can also kick it back into the annotation queue. Someone else can look at it. And if it is representative of an interaction that you want to judge your application against in the future, then that becomes, again, a part of your golden data set that you then run experiments against. And that's where you structure your experiment and that's kind of thing. But I think it depends on the org as far as who is considered the subject matter expert in that flow.
Who's the guy? He was at LangChain and LangGraph. His name is like Roger something. He's like a professor of AI and machine learning at Stanford. He runs an AI fund. He was interviewing Harrison Chase at the.
I thought it was Andrew.
He goes. Maybe it's Andrew. He goes.
Andrew Ng.
Andrew Ng. Yeah, of course. A luminary in the AI world.
Yeah, deep learning.ai.
Because we use LangGraph for almost everything.
He founded Coursera.
Yeah, genius. And he goes, we use LangGraph for almost everything. It allows us to explore more compute space. But who cares about 100% code coverage when it comes to evals? Evals are super important. But he goes, one of the evaluators is me. Yeah. Is the domain expert. Is this thing working? At the speed at which things are moving, how can I really expect me and my team to write tests around all of my code?
So you have for the online evaluations, for example, right? You have the ability to have LLM as a judge. You can write your own evaluators, custom Python sort of scripts. We also have pre-built evaluators that are in there. So if you want to look, judge responses based off of conciseness, et cetera. But yeah.
You mentioned annotators and data sets a couple of times. What percentage of your customers are using data sets and annotations for fine tuning of those agents that they're building? Is that nascent or growing or zero or?
It's definitely not zero. There's for sure. I would say it'd be hard for me to put a 10%. No, more than that for sure. Yeah, I mean, I think again when we get into the idea that taking something from prototype to production, it's really easy to create a demo and something that is cool and is fun to play with. But in order to feel good about it going to production, you're going to be meaningfully into both online and offline evaluations. Again, that first step, that offline evaluation, is going to be predicated on the fact that you have a data set that you're going to judge against, right, when you run your experiments. So there's two different ways to look at it. You can either compile a data set from production traces as your users interact with it. You can upload or have AI generate a data set that you're going to compare against, or you can upload your own. If you have like your own data set, you're able to upload CSV, JSON file, and have that as being your sort of reference that you're going to peg all that stuff against. But eval-driven development is fundamental as far as having a production-ready agent, or feeling confident about having a production-ready agent.
Yeah, we built that doctor chatbot app. It was really hard to create tests because we're like an infinite amount of things can happen in a conversation between a patient and a doctor agent. You guys have an evaluator called a trajectory eval.
Yeah.
And it basically says like, does the conversation generally go into a satisfying direction?
Yeah.
I can't test every individual component, but does the user say, oh, thanks, at the end of the really, really long chat? I think those sort of like non-deterministic evaluators are also as important as like, does 1 + 1 actually equal 2? Did it actually respond to the right math?
Well, let's look at what Alex showed earlier with the way, there's cosine similarity, in the eval framework, right, for Arcade, right? Because like, is the answer, are they directionally correct, right? That's the point, right? Any other questions?
Jason made it pretty clear in his definition of what's free and what's paid. That's still a question for all of you, the business model for each of your enterprises. I have no idea at yours, I kind of know yours, and I understand the split, but not, how do you guys work with customers in dollars and cents?
Yeah, good question. So we candidly haven't fully turned on our billing system for our SaaS platform, so you can go sign up for Arcade, use it, in limited ways for free, go nuts. That'll eventually move into a pure kind of consumption-based model. You're going to pay for actions, right, that are taken on the platform. It's going to be pretty simple and pretty easy to understand.
So for us, there's a couple of core plans, right, on the commercial side. And so you have one, I think it's, we have a plus plan, a developer plan. You don't need to talk to me in order to do that. You can drop a credit card for, say, like the developer plan, et cetera. And we can go into more detail about like all the specifics about what you get at each level. I think once you want to move to an enterprise plan, which is where we're actually moving towards, we're getting away from, so in developer, there's a high threshold as far as seat count, so you can only have, say, 10 users of that plan. As you're getting closer to, say, building or getting to production sort of concerns or considerations for your agent, that's probably where enterprise makes sense, because you also then get access to a deployed engineer, you get architecture reviews, best practices, we get into how to structure things, right? So there's a lot of different resources that come there. You also get things like SSO and authentication, et cetera. And so that there's the enterprise plan. We also do have a startup plan. So if you are a startup organization, there's special pricing and consideration there. But there's a delineation there where you can consume, yourself without ever having to talk to the likes of me.
Seat-based or like
for developer, it's seat-based. Okay. Yeah, and then once we move to enterprise, there's no concept of seats. We don't care how many people are using it. The platform is then, the usage is drawn down based off of traces and nodes executed. So a trace is just an input-output pair, right? So I make a call and the agent provides a response. That is one trace. If that call maybe hits 4 or 5 different nodes, then those are 5 or 4 different nodes executed. And so the rate at which you burn those down is consistent. So it's $5 will get you 1,000 traces at our introductory sort of level. $1 will get you 1,000 traces. For self-hosted, there is a certain minimum that will basically, if you used it all for LangSmith, you would get 10 million traces. If you were using it all for LangGraph platform, for deploying apps, etc., you get 50 million nodes executed. We don't care any mix of the two until you get to your minimum commitment, right? So you can use it all for LangSmith and tracing. You can use it all for deployment. Any mix of the two until you hit your enterprise, like the intro cap.
There might be an architecture consideration.
So from our architecture perspective, again, air-capped environments, self-hosted, right? We do have SaaS. There's a control plane, a data plane. I mean, I don't want to hog the totality of our time, but we can get into it. And
ours is very similar.
The back-end dependencies, and there's a database, Postgres, Redis, etc. The only data that's going outbound on a self-hosted is going to be telemetry data, so we understand, how many traces you've used or how many nodes executed, right? So. Sorry, did I answer the question?
Time and materials. I run a consulting business. Time and materials. We use data and technology to help retail and D2C brands see their business more clearly and graduate to their next stage of growth.
That's pretty easy.
Consultancy. Billing is easy.
One thought, but I know your answer already, because your answer is quality is what's stopping things getting into production.
That's what our developer said. Yeah, quality.
I assume your answer is going to be secure access to tooling.
So I think it's a couple things, right? So from experience of what we've been seeing and talking to, we talked to a lot of very, very large companies and some startups. But like, what's interesting is that large enterprises have been investing very heavily in AI for several years, right? And a lot of those investments have been almost board-driven, executive-driven mandates. And there's a lot of pressure now to get things into production, but not just get things into production, get things into production in a much more efficient manner, right? So yes, authentication authorization, I was in New York a couple weeks ago, this AI team within a bank saw MCP, they built their internal APIs into MCP servers, they wrote some agents that had to talk to that, that plus Salesforce and the FactSet API, et cetera, et cetera. They built a demo, the business loved it, and security was like, yeah, no way, right? Because there was no authentication or authorization model that was really part of how the LLM was talking to the tools, right? Especially for their proprietary internal APIs. And so it's authentication all the time, but it's also actually well-written tools, right? Going back to evals are everything, right? If you just wrap an API and you feed it to an LLM and you expect to get highly accurate answers, you're going to be very disappointed, right? So you actually have to unpack an API and write proper functions, and then that function becomes a tool. And then you can tie an authorization scope to that tool. And when you take like tightly coupled scopes plus well-written tools, you wind up getting high accuracy and much lower token consumption. Right, that's the other big blocker to moving things in production is we have to become much better stewards of how we consume tokens, right? And like if you use, let's say, like a couple weeks ago, Zapier made a big announcement. With OpenAI, you can just use anything in their entire API catalog. And all of a sudden you do a send email, action, and it's using 30,000 tokens, right? Because it just wasn't AI native. It's not built, that API integration was not built to take that action, right?
With the rate of decrease in cost per token, like, do you need to be concerned about that? Or can you just be like, by the time this thing is out there, it'll be 80% cheaper?
No, because you're gonna see, like, yes, older models, the cost per token will keep going down, but as the newer models come, then it'll creep back up and then it'll go back down. Yes, I think in general, we have to get more efficient, right? but not just in the token consumption, but in accuracy. Like if we are going to put agents in performing tasks that require precision, right? You can't be right 70% of the time, right? If you're an employee, what's up?
Latency.
Yeah.
Yeah,
You gotta read 30,000 tokens every time, and
Yes,
user experience is.
I'm much more concerned with the latency.
Correct.
But that's also
But that's
it's a function.
It's
of
a function of it, right? You know, if you're cycling through, like great example. Let's say you're just wrapping an API and you're using primitive. You're basically saying, I'm just gonna, because in order to make this integration, this system is saying I need basically like a master token, right? So it has all permission. So every time, let's say that agent or tool is called, it's cycling through, right, every possible endpoint before it can do anything.
Some of it's about responsible development, right? Some of it's also going to be about as these tools improve. Like, so for example, now we have node caching, right? So maybe you don't necessarily have to traverse the entirety of the graph if some data is cached at a specific node.
That's why
That shortens stuff up.
Yes.
Like understand, optimize against node placement.
Yeah, there's there's I think the key answer is like there's no easy button. And I think a lot of the early efforts, there's been a lot of, well, let's try to do it in a very easy way. And
There's definitely some brute force.
right, and
that's happening.
move incredibly fast, and not like there's still software engineering, right, and engineering and data science and architecture that needs to go in to doing these things right. So
That's all the time we have. Thank you, everyone.
thank you guys. Thanks everybody.
I appreciate everyone's time.